Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. I cannot express enough that each report that I take here at BBR is part of a person's life story. It's not just a random event that's easily forgotten. They each have their own unique experiences to share, and they finally decide to come forward for many different reasons. Just like yourselves, you found your way here on your own. You were influenced by your life's actions. I once spoke with the niece of a grand lady called Una who lived in Ireland, and she wanted me to take her aunt's experience and preserve it for prosperity reasons, so that it could be passed down the generations and not end up forgotten in time. Tonight I'm sharing one experience that has taken over 40 years to document, and I will be forever grateful that this tale is finally being shared. I feel it's one of the UK's scariest encounters by far. It's a startling case, and it's one of the most jaw-dropping reports I've ever received. And it takes place in Hale Green in Sussex. Our witness Tom was a tenant at the time with his previous wife, and he was so frightened by what he saw, he got his shotgun ready in case they breached the glass panel door. I was contacted by Tom's current wife, who asked me if I could video call Tom so he could share the details of the most puzzling experience to happen to him when he lived at Cottage, Hale Green, Chiddingly, Sussex. I rang the next day and we had a long chat, which I recorded, and Tom's happy for me to share the details of that chat and what took place that night, and what it's like to have an experience like this. Tom touches on the battle all witnesses have, the warring emotions of needing to know more whilst having no real way to find any answers. It makes for a constant tug of war. We all think it, do I keep silent? Do I speak up? I recognised several things as we were chatting, and I was able to assure Tom that there are other reports that have a similar body shape and type or facial features that also have the howling cries or the leaping, bounding movement, some of which are not that far from Hale Cottage. Tom said, "In the 1980s, I was lucky enough to rent Hale Cottage in Chiddingly. Its name has changed over the years, but the cottage is still there. It's a beautiful old home set next to the valley. There's a small stream and a wooded area behind the house, which was part of my garden space. There were lots of paranormal events going back decades at the cottage, but nothing like the events of that night. I'll touch on some of those events later, Deb, but for now, I'd like to chat about the experience with the ape-like creatures that myself and my previous wife saw in the early 1980s. I remember it was late at night, about 1 a.m. in early summer. I remember the moon was full and bright. It was really hot, so we had the upstairs windows of the cottage wide open to let in some breeze in the hopes of getting some sleep. We had nightingales in the woodland, and we could hear them singing at night between themselves. It was a beautiful place to live, and the setting was idyllic. In fact, I'd say it was magical. There was a really small lane at the front of the cottage that at times would become a bit of a rat run for people to avoid the main A roads. The main village about 3 miles away, and they would sometimes have live bands there. But by this time, the pub was shut and there were no cars on the road. It was really silent until it wasn't. I was in the bathroom at the cottage and the window was open and I heard a strange sound. At first, I thought it was a voice. This sounded like someone calling out. So I went upstairs to the bedroom as the window there looked out in the direction of the strange noise. It sounded like a young woman's voice. I asked my ex-wife if she could hear it, and she confirmed that she could, and that it also sounded like a female crying out. We were a bit unsure what to do, so we carried on listening, trying to see something out there that would account for the strange cries we were hearing. As we listened, the cry changed. It went from sounding like a really distressed woman to becoming almost cat-like, and wailing. It sounded like cats yarling to each other, but at the same time, you could tell that it wasn't a cat making the noise. We were completely puzzled, and as I chided with myself that it was just a cat, it changed again, back into an almost human-like voice. The voice of a young woman asking for help. I clearly heard, help me," in a very distressing voice that would then become a snarling sound. I kept trying to process what I was hearing, and I became concerned that this could be a young lady walking home alone who was being or had been attacked. Or was it someone lost in the woods or along the lane? I kept thinking she'd been pushed from a car maybe and was shouting out for help. With the pub being only 3 miles away, I wondered if it was someone playing a trick or messing about, or even a lone frisky courting couple. Weighing this up in seconds, I decided I'd better go out and walk the lane and see if there was someone out there needing help. And as I set off to do that, the sound changed back into the wailing, snarling cries. We both realised that the cries seemed to be getting nearer to us, and they were coming from the trees in the woodland. This made me a bit annoyed, as the only logical thought I had was that as the cottage is such a reputation locally for strange going on and paranormal activity, some idiot was out there trying to scare us. So I thought, I'm going to have to do something to scare them off, or at least let them know that we're at home and we're onto them. Sometimes making a loud noise can run someone off, so I thought about getting my shotgun and firing it into the air through the window. Then things seemed to happen really quickly. The noise intensified, and it was joined by the sound of things being trashed and broken in the woods at the bottom of the garden, which was pretty overgrown. And there was a thick hedge that had been left so long it had grown up into the trees. Beyond the woods, there was a long field, and that's where the crashing sounds were coming from. Trying to see what this was, I was almost hanging out the window, when suddenly these things came bounding and leaping from the trees. They were absolutely horrible and terrifying to look at. They were crashing through the hedge in the garden, making a lot of noise as they came through. At first, it was just one of them, and then another came through, and then another, and another, and another. And I think there was somewhere around 8 to 12 of them in total. The only thought that I can clearly remember was, what the fuck is going on, and what are they? I was torn between this being something absolutely scary going on, or that there's someone out there who's doing this, and I don't understand what it is. It was a moment of complete confusion, shock, and some panic. The next thing I became aware of is that these things were bouncing or leaping, almost like wallabies do. The movement was really strange. I describe it as bounding. They were coming straight for the house, and I had no idea what the hell they were. I was so scared, I just didn't know what to do. So without really thinking about it, I ran, grabbed my shotgun, and completely naked, as it was so hot. But I was so shocked and annoyed that they were in our garden, I set off to confront them without thinking about getting any clothes. I went downstairs. I quietly went outside. I crept up the side of the lane, and while concealed in the grasses, I looked through our back garden gate. And what I was seeing made no sense at all. Whatever they looked like monkeys or apes, and they were about 4 to 5 feet tall. They were naked and covered in shaggy hair, and they also had the appearance that they were scrawny and emaciated in some way. They had a muscular jaw with huge bared teeth like that of a dog. And what stood out to me was their enormous bulging thighs and legs that they were hopping on. They were not on all fours, they remained upright at all times, and I noticed that their arms were really long. They weren't hairy all over. Their chests were bare with very sparse clumps of hair, and there were clumps of hair hanging off them all over, except on the legs that were properly covered in hair. The faces were scrawny, emaciated. They had receding hairlines, sloping down to a big brow ridge, with dark, shiny eyes underneath, bony cheekbones, and a flattened ape-like nose, with huge protruding nostrils, sloping down to a mouth with prominent teeth. The arms were thin and long, but the thighs were thick and muscular and properly covered in hair. After they crashed through the shrubbery into the garden, they were moving around everywhere as if they were searching or looking for things. All the time, they were continually sniffing the air as if trying to hone in on something. I was also conscious of the cloying smell coming from them. It was terrible and hard to describe. I've never smelt anything like it before or since. It smelt rank and just hung there in the air. I'm just standing there, naked, absolutely terrified and paralysed to the spot. I couldn't move an inch while my brain tried to work out what was playing out in front of me. All I could think about is at some point that they would know that I was there. They were bound to pick up on my smell as they moved closer and closer to the house. In fact, I would say they fixated on the house. I watched them and I was so scared I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. It was pounding away. At that point, I realised my ex-wife was hanging out the upstairs window watching them, and she was as transfixed as I was. We had a glass partition in the back door, and one of them went directly to it. It put its nose up to the keyhole, and it was sniffing and sniffing inside. At that, I was even more horrified, and then I could tell from its movement that it knew someone was there, and it looked at my ex-wife as she was looking out of the window. Another one turned in my direction, and I knew at that moment I'd been seen. It looked directly into my eyes, and I knew that I needed to break the spell, because if I didn't, I felt like I'd lose myself if I didn't act. And I acted on instinct. I have had other encounters that have scared me before, and I'm one of those people who runs at what confronts me rather than away. It's like I have to attack whatever it is that scares me. It's like my gut tells me if I run, I'm done for. So I raised the gun up, roared at them as I rushed straight towards them. And as I did this, all their faces turned towards me. And in a moment that was utterly horrifying, they turned and fled back to the trees. I think I was in a primal state at that time. The amount of noise I made as I roared, rushing towards them, was not planned. It wasn't a conscious thought, more an involuntary action of self-preservation. I saw their faces change, and they looked panicked, almost like they didn't know what to do. There were lots of hornbeam trees entangled with that living hedge, and they headed for them, leapt into them. They bounded about 10 to 12 feet in the air. Without thinking, I shot at one of them. I shot both barrels at it, and nothing. It didn't affect it. I watched as they went into the trees and headed down the long field that slopes downwards for about a quarter of a mile until it reaches the stream at the bottom. They moved together, and they were making a weird whooping noise as they went. They moved in that strange bounding motion, and then they were gone. I got myself out of there somehow, back into the house. Neither myself nor my ex-wife would talk about it for several minutes as we tried to pull ourselves together. I don't remember much other than waking up in the morning. It was quite gratuitous. I had a friend coming over that morning. He pulled up on his motorbike really early, and I started to tell him what had happened the previous evening. But I could see on his face he was wondering what the hell I was talking about. But I persisted. I asked him to bear with me and come and look at the back garden with me. It was a very overgrown garden, and you could see that it had been disturbed and was in a complete mess. The branches where they'd come through the hedges were all broken and smashed. It was the same with the trees they'd jumped into. Their branches were broken too. The grass in the garden was really high, and you could see where something had been moving around, making a clear and visible mess. I'm so glad that my friend turned up, as I was able to show someone the visible evidence of what had happened. But over the last 40 years, I have struggled to share with people what's happened. I told my current wife, she's very open-minded and she's had her own experiences, and she thought contacting you would be a good idea. I still get upset when I share it. Back then, there was no talk of apes or monkeys here in the UK, let alone creatures like this. Now it's easier to reference as there are lots of programs about them, and in those programs they sometimes describe a strange smell, which I distinctly remember smelling. The descriptions also match with what I saw. Now it wasn't a cloudy night, and I was of sound mind, and until we heard the strange cries, everything was perfectly normal. The moon was really bright, and you could see them clearly, even when they ran off across the field. There was nothing I could have been mistaking them for. I wasn't thinking about seeing something scary, and I had no interest that could have influenced me. Even now, I don't know what you would call them. The strange thighs were almost like ghost legs, like you'd see with a fawn or a satyr. They were remarkably thick, but they didn't have hooves. It was more the reminiscent shape of the thighs that looked goat-like. Their arms were really out of proportion too. They dangled down to the knees like an ape's arms do. And they moved with that weird bounding gait. They didn't walk, they bounced. I cannot imagine what that experience was like for Tom and his ex-wife. It's bad enough thinking someone's been attacked or harmed outside your home in a rural setting, as the police are a very long way away. What if it's more than one assailant and you find yourself confronted by a gang of people? Or if this gang's there to rob or harm you? There's only yourself there to protect your wife. How long will it take you to get to the back door if they start to break in? What if you shoot one and the others turn on you? Can you reload quickly enough to take on 8 to 12 terrifying creatures that look like they've come from hell in search of something, hoping that that something isn't you? What they are is one question, but more significant to me is why they were there and what were they searching for. Tom explained they were moving around the garden, sniffing as they went. One of them made it to the keyhole, or the peephole as we call it here in the UK. The only thing between it and Tom's ex-wife was a thin panel of glass. Would they have tried to enter if they didn't realise they'd been seen? And how many times has this happened before without people at the property knowing? I didn't mention it to Tom during our talk, but he could have been sound asleep many times without knowing what was sniffing around his garden. The village is 3 miles away, and no one's hearing you shout from there. There are no lights in those woods or fields. It's you and a lone cottage out in the wilds. I also wondered if any previous tenants at the cottage had reported anything strange. Was there something about the cottage itself or the land below it that was part of the puzzle? I asked Tom if he'd share any knowledge he had on the cottage and its previous owners, and he did have a lot of information that I can use in my searches going forward. He said, the cottage that I lived in became really well known for being haunted, and for me, it's always been in a very beautiful way, but the people who lived there just before me had an awful time of it. I didn't know it when I took it on, but apparently there was a steady stream of people who wouldn't or couldn't stay there in peace. Some people say they can feel a hand touching them on their shoulders at times, and there is some strange presence that can be felt. As soon as I moved my things in, a lot of scary things started happening, but I didn't feel frightened by them. In fact, I was fascinated with them, so things changed for the positive for me. I would feel like something was always around, or that there were people milling in and out of the cottage. Each night, as I went to sleep, I would hear a chant, and it sounded as if someone had a tin with little ball bearings in it, and they'd shake it to make the noise. They'd shake that tin directly over my head, and I'd instantly fall asleep. The activity became so normal, I'd say things to them, or talk to them, as if they were part of the family. People had asked to come and stay over, as they'd heard so many tales about the cottage and the paranormal activity that was happening there. The only warning I'd give them would be, don't say you don't believe in it or that it's bollocks, as something will happen to make you believe. For example, we had some students visit us one evening, and they brought along a psychology professor who was a hardcore non-believer and skeptic. I should explain, we were not expecting them. I was in one room with a few of my friends, and they came to the cottage about 10 p.m. The professor explained that some of his students had suggested he came here to witness and document some of the activity that was taking place. His attitude was, this is all a load of rubbish, and he didn't expect to hear or see anything, and he kept saying that out loud. And I told him not to keep saying that, as something would happen. As he asked me why, a book that was on the bookshelf came flying out and hit him on the head, and his reaction was to accuse me of rigging something up. He said, I don't know how you've done that, at which point it happened again. He got really angry and accused me of doing this, and then books were flying everywhere, and he just left the house. I didn't know he was coming, so I don't know why he thought I'd set something up. Now, thinking back on it, most of the things that happened in the cottage would be lovely things, but every now and again, something horrible would come through. This happened about 3 or 4 times while I lived there. Tom went on to explain that due to the large iron and mineral deposits that the land had been left in a horrible state for centuries. Going far back in time, before the Middle Ages and throughout the Roman invasion, people heavily mined the land. There were ironworks and blast furnaces everywhere. He feels, as I do, that this could have opened up the area like a portal for anything to come through. Anyone living there would be open to any and all of those happenings. But there was one family who thrived at the cottage long term, and they didn't have any problems at all. The cottage was set on a stud farm, and in the 1930s through to the 1960s, it was home to a family who were gypsies. They were travelling folk who'd settled in the area. The owner was the elderly grandfather, and his son lived there with his 2 daughters, and they ran and worked on the horse farm. They knew what was going on at the cottage, and they spoke about it to other people they knew. There was a very large travelling population that would come around harvest time of the year, and they eventually settled in the homes in the area. In the first year we lived in the cottage, and gypsies would come up to us in the pub and chat with us about what happened there. And I realised each time they'd ask how we were getting on in the home and whether we were okay. When I'd say yeah, they would ask if I was sure. Almost like they were expecting us to up and leave. After a few times, I asked them why, and they would say weird things would happen up there. But I told them I was okay with it, and it was a pretty positive experience for us. After that, if we went into a pub, they'd buy us drinks and stop for a chat. When the elderly grandfather died, he must have been very important, as people came from all around, far and wide, to honour his passing. The country folk were not aware of his standing in the gypsy community, and they were amazed to see people arriving in cars and carts and buggies and horseback to sit at the property until it was time to take him on his final walk home. His family members dressed him in his finest clothes, tied him into his favourite chair, and en masse they carried him on their shoulders all around the boundary of his land. They took him to all of the woodlands and the fields in the valley. And when the procession returned to the cottage, he was no longer in his chair. He was in his chosen resting place, as tradition no longer allows. Tom no longer lives at the cottage. He lives elsewhere with his present wife. And he has had some paranormal experiences as a child. But like most of us, this was seen as a very vivid imagination, or a daydream of some kind. So over time, he stopped experiencing anything. I'll be chatting with Tom next week while we cover some of those events. And he did, however, have an experience with a fawn, a satyr or pan as we call him here in the UK. This was in a different cottage, and he said the little chap just ran past him and didn't pay him any attention at all. I wanted to find out what I could about the land, the ancient sites or burial places, and I noticed the name Glebe close to the cottage, which tells me this land was owned by the church at some point in history. Chidingley appears in the Domesday Book, 1086. It had a recorded population of 3 households, putting it in the smallest 20% of settlements recorded in the UK. Now, let's take a look at some of the cases around the cottage and any other reports here that mention the leaping or bounding motion of the creature seen. In a case quite close, around the area of Hailsham, there's a report that came out of Phantom and Monsters website, and it centres around something that happened in 1984. So just a little later than what was happening to Tom. And in the blog, it says, during a time when it was normal for us kids to be out playing in the woods, I was out there with a few friends. I think at the time we were playing not far from what people know as Falkington Wood. Around dusk, we were all lighting a campfire, when suddenly, from the shadows, almost like a good horror film, we heard the snap of a twig. We all sensed that we were being watched, and we felt like we were being goaded by what was lurking in the bushes, as if it wanted us to come out and fight. We all armed ourselves with sticks and stones, only to have our eyes met by a horrifying sight when it emerged. Out from the shadows came a tall, spindly figure, which seemed to be covered in hair, which in turn was matted with leaves. The creature gave off a horrible stench, and through its entangled hair, we could see that it had these awful eyes. I'm sure you can imagine we were all terrified, and we fled, never once looking behind us to see if the monster was pursuing us. Of course, no one believed our story. But as we got older, most of us, except one, remained friends. We often spoke about the creature, and we named him the Leaf Man. People often ask, were we the victims of a hoax? And he said, I can't see that happening. It was not a man in a suit. Oddly, there is another report in the same mag where the person also calls it the Leaf Man, but this is from Kent, and it involved a group of youths playing in an area when they saw it. So that's it's a strange one. I remember that Tom said it looked emaciated almost, and that kind of fits a little bit with that description. And we also have the problem that a witness can only go off their knowledge pool. So we could have several witnesses reporting the same creature, but they would describe it differently from their knowledge. So there is also an account at the Chalk Hills, just near Ringmer, of a leaping creature that frightened a couple of campers in the woods in the 1970s. We've got a case out just to the northeast in Burwash, and it says, my friend was driving home one night, and she's positive she saw 2 red eyes in the trees on the side of the road, approximately 8 feet off the ground. Also in our group of friends, who all belong to the same group of healers and psychics, there's another lady who saw a very tall, hairy Sasquatch-type creature with one of her lambs under its arm. She was so incensed, she shouted at it to drop a lamb, which it did, and it turned and ran away. That's a very strange account, but you hear that in America and Canada and other places in the world where there are Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and whatever name you want to put on it. The description of what Tom saw fits very well with what we would call a gugwi, or possibly a skunk ape, they would call it in America. So it's not a typical ape man, it's not a typical dog man, it's kind of a mix of the two. So it's like ape-like features with canine teeth. There was a couple and they were camping at the Sussex in a caravan. And the lady said when she was in bed at the night, she looked up and saw a hairy face looking at her through the window. And then you've got the Henfield humanoid creature. We've got one just at Crowborough. And that was where a creature on 31st of June 21, people were in a car and they saw something very dark move behind the car. So these are all accounts that kind of encircle the area. Now, no matter what direction we go in, there are other reports of hairy, ape-like creatures. But I want to have a look at the leaping motion because I think that's quite important. It's been mentioned a number of times to me over the years. And the witnesses in those cases use the words bounding, leaping, bouncing, almost kangaroo, wallaby, or frog like. They also speak of the thigh muscles, and you would need decent thigh muscles to move at that kind of pace. There are a number of reports where it speaks about the creature leaping from one side of the road to the other in one bound, or leaping from the ground up into a tree, or up onto a high wall, and in one case, up onto a stack of logs when a number of gentlemen were out investigating. There's a case not too far from me in the northwest of England that was reported to me by a witness I know quite well now. We didn't know each other at the time, but over years, witnesses kind of become friends. And listen to the description of the creature that he described seeing. The area has also been heavily mined over the centuries, and there is a lot of ground disturbance. And the creature in this case was described as sandy coloured, full of muscle and hairy, and was around 7 feet tall. But it's a description of the movement I want you to listen to. And it came from a man who is now in his 50s, but he was a 10-year-old boy when this happened. He was still at primary school and he was next to the brook. He was down there just tadpoling, or looking for sticklebacks or whatever. And he said, there's a 6-foot fence that ran at the side of the brook where I was. And as I was fishing, a creature I cannot put a name to jumped clean over the brook in one leap and landed dead still on the other side. Then this strange looking thing bounded off again. I thought it was a giant kangaroo at first, because it was kind of sandy coloured, and it hopped. I followed it as I thought it had escaped from a zoo, but I couldn't keep up with it. But I then realised it wasn't a kangaroo and it wasn't hopping. It was bounding, leaping, kind of jumping. Each jump or bound was around 6 or 7 metres at a time. It was about 7 foot tall, sandy coloured, and full of muscle. It's more like an upright lion without a mane. I can still see it to this day, and I watched it for a good few minutes before it disappeared. He said he checked the local newspapers, zoos, and all of that from being an adult, and he couldn't work out what it was. Now, there's a legend down there of Perchman, and people are said to see him in the woodlands, and he will shake trees or make a bit of a racket. There's several UFO reports down there. There's a report just to the north of it by about a mile where several kids see a 6 to 7 foot tall creature that was covered in hair that came out of one of the cave systems there that runs along the river. So there are a multitude of them reports in that area, but it was my interest in the bound. There was also a report, and it clicks into Tom's as well, where somebody heard what they described as a creature screaming in distress. It said it sounded like it was gargling blood at the time, and it was absolutely horrible to listen to. If we continue to go north and head over the Scottish borders, there is a case in Ailf where the witness described a black leaping creature. And this happened on the 31st of July 2016. Charmaine Fraser was the investigator who took this report. And the witness said, "I just wanted to contact you to tell you about a sighting my wife had last Sunday evening at 7:30 p.m. whilst driving along a wooded section of the A926 near Ailth towards Kirrimore. I was driving, I didn't see anything, but my wife in the back suddenly said, 'Did you see that?' She said she saw something a distance ahead on the verge of the road within the dense woodland that she initially thought was a man walking, but then it leapt further into the wood very quickly and stopped. She said it looked black, like a shadow, dark in colour. It was tall and wide. She said she got the impression it was about to cross the road, and then it leapt even deeper into the wood upon hearing the car. She was a bit shaken up and said her hair was standing up on end. And I think that's kind of okay, because I would have been in the same position. And the driver said he didn't think of stopping because he had his elderly aunt in the car and his wife was with him. But I'm really grateful that they reached out to Charmaine and shared that experience with them. Now, in the area of Blythefield, which is in, let me just check. It's in Staffordshire, very close to Cannock Chase, and it was a report that came to Nick Redfern, and he wrote about it in December of 2002 for the Express and Star newspaper, because he was writing a book on the exploits of the man monkey of the Shropshire Canal. A chap called Mike Atkins got in touch with him because he'd had something happen in 1996, but he had never shared it with anybody before. So he said he was driving over the road bridge that crosses Staffordshire Blythefield Reservoir in the early hours of the morning when a giant, hairy animal practically launched itself across the road going at the car. Fortunately, Mike skillfully avoided a crash, but he said the creature leapt out in front of him, and he had to swerve to avoid it. Not far from Wimbledon, we have an area called Ewell Lane, and a couple driving home in a car on Valentine's night, 2012, saw a creature that leapt into the road. Scott Martin and his family were travelling home about 10:30 p.m. when they saw the mysterious dark figure with no features dart across the road in front of them before leaping 15 feet over a roadside bank as they approached Nescott College on the Ewell bypass. Obviously shook up by their experience, even the couple's 4-year-old son he was too scared to sleep on his own that night after what he'd seen. And the taxi driver actually admitted that he was petrified and he didn't want to drive back alone. Mr. Martin is 40, he's a manager of a building company who lives in Blue Cedars in Banstead, and he said, "We were driving down the Ewell bypass and saw a man on the other side of the road. We didn't pay much attention until he started crossing over to our side. The next thing, he jumped over the centre fencing on the road and ran across 2 lanes. On the other side of the road, it banks easily 15 feet in height. And this figure crossed our road, climbed the bank, and was gone in one leap. And he was out of sight in about 2 seconds. All 4 of us were baffled and voiced our sighting straight away, at the same time. We all saw a dark figure with no real features, hard to make out, but fast in movement, with an ease of hurdling obstacles that I've never seen." He said, "My last image of him was going through the bushes at the top of the bank." Mr. Martin said the driver of the taxi shared his fears as the mysterious figure made off. "I'm not usually one to be freaked by these sightings, but the cab driver was petrified. He didn't want to drive back alone," said Martin. "I'm honestly baffled by this sighting. I'm intrigued by it because it was so real, but strange." His wife, Sasha, said it was more than someone. It was like it was trying to cross the road of the dual carriageway and didn't want to be seen. That was weird. My little boy was really freaked out. The family have since likened the figure to the legendary Spring-Heeled Jack, a mysterious dark figure reported to be responsible for a string of attacks in the 1800s. Well, there have been other attacks between the 1800s and now, and there's a report in Glasgow at the Side Hill Cemetery of a winged creature or a dark man in a cape that could be said to be Springfield Jack. But what Tom saw was very different. It was ape-like. It was animalistic. It sniffed the air. It was leaping and bounding in a strange way. That would be scary. Anytime you see something that's out of the norm, that doesn't fit with something that you usually see, that's incredibly scary. But to be at home in a very rural location is entirely different. If you live in the city, you are pretty much protected. You've got neighbours everywhere. There's CCTV. There's more lights out there than you need. But as you leave the city and you move through the council estates and then into the suburbs and out into the rural land and the green belt, those streetlights stop. I live in an area just like that. And at night, even driving home from, say, Birmingham or Liverpool, there is a part of our motorway that is not lit at all. And it's awful driving out there when it's like that. And you drive for hours and you'll just see one lone cottage with a light on out there in the distance. And I often think, how easy would it be for something to be moving around out here and not seen? I also think, what is it like if you're that person in that farmhouse on your own and you do experience it? Tom's account is not that far from Daisy's. In fact, it's not that far at all. And if you remember, Daisy was the witness who saw a almost reddish colour dogman, wolfman, I should say, and he kind of vanished in front of her eyes. Her own mother saw something up in a tree that was absolutely terrifying. And she saw something walking through the woodland that stopped her walking the woods again. She would only go if it was winter time and there was no leaves on the trees. I think it's much harder to be in a rural setting and experience something like this. What could Tom have done that night? He was far braver than anyone I know because I would have stayed within the house. But I understand the dilemma. What you're thinking is, what if that's somebody out there that's shouting for help? What if it is somebody out there that needs us and we ignore it? What would you feel like the next day? But there are other things to take into consideration. Without thinking, he went outside. We don't know what those creatures were there for. I suspect they're connected to the land and all of the destruction that's gone on over the years. And I think they're probably negative. But they didn't run and attack him. They turned and jumped into the trees en masse. And there was more than enough of them to outnumber him. So they weren't there to hurt him. Why were they sniffing round that garden? Is it like the case of Fred, where for years he was upstairs, asleep in bed, and he never knew what walked that land until he got that elderly that he had to be brought downstairs. And that night, when he got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, he saw what he described as a werewolf that used something between a hand and a paw to tap onto his window. And he also said it looked shocked to see him. These are lonely farmhouses out on rural roads. What if these people are in bed and this is going on and they just don't know? One thing that really stood out for me was when Tom said that every night it sounded as if someone had a tin and they had ball bearings in it and they shook it over his head and he would immediately go to sleep. What's happening when he's going to sleep? Is that, let's put him to sleep so he doesn't know what's going on? Or is it just a natural thing that he hears before he goes to sleep? I don't know. But I have a sinking feeling that maybe it's all connected in some way. And as I said, I'll pick up with him. I'm going to speak to him again on Monday. And I'm going to try and take him back to the experience he had as a child. And then further on to now. He is in his 70s and he wants his stories recorded. And I understand that. I'm often asked, what will happen when you die, Deb? And I don't have an answer for that. But one thing that I know will happen, these stories are already out there. they're on YouTube, they're on the podcast, they're written out on the website, people read them on Facebook. I've started a conversation for people. I've lit the match, I've tried to do the best I can to get this subject into what you would call mainstream media, I suppose. So people stopped saying, well, all right, we're okay if you've seen a werewolf, well, we're not actually, because it wasn't connected to a paranormal account or it wasn't connected to a UFO account. That doesn't matter. The meat and potatoes is that juxtaposition between the witness and the creature. Why is it there? What does it want? Because they're not like us. They don't just wander around because they're bored. A creature will go somewhere, whether that be an animal or a being of any kind, because there is a reason for it being there. And sometimes it can be as simple as the energy. And I keep coming back to, what were they sniffing for? What were they sniffing around that building for? And the fact, I think, that the grandfather of the travellers had probably kept them at bay for a very long time. He will have understood that land in a way that other people wouldn't. It's handed down to him. It's in his gene pool. It's in his blood. He's probably kept it very safe. I had a look into all of the mining that gone on, and it was immense. Even at the 16th century, you should see what the French had done to it. It was absolutely unbelievable. You wouldn't know it if you saw it now. It's absolutely beautiful. It reminds me very much of Brown Candover, when I shared the report of the black-eyed werewolf. That happened with Willow. Very similar setup. I would imagine there are a number of sites, historical and otherwise, of worship, or we wouldn't have been using the word glebe. It wouldn't be priory land. It wouldn't be church land. They did that for a reason. There was something special about that area. And I believe that all of the destruction that was gone on over the centuries has opened something and enabled something to come through. And that can work either way. It can enable something from our side to go in, or something from that side to come through. And I'll keep you up to date with this case, because I know you've got a real interest in it. I've only just started talking to Tom, so I'm sure as the weeks go on that I'll have more to share, and I'll keep you updated with that. But for now, I want you to think about, how would you feel if you were sat somewhere now and that came out of the trees in your back garden? You'd be absolutely terrified, wouldn't you? And I think that's okay, because we don't give ourselves permission to be scared. And when you're confronted with something scary, you're allowed to be scared. So I will be back next week with more from Tom, the same time and the same day. Good night, everyone.